The invisible rule that controls your results. There is something strange about how life works. If you observe people carefully, you start to notice a pattern. Some individuals seem to move forward almost naturally. Opportunities appear, doors open, things begin to work out. Meanwhile, others spend years trying. They work hard, they stay motivated, they keep pushing forward. And yet, nothing truly changes. The results remain the same. For a long time, people have tried to explain this difference. Some say it's talent, others say it's luck. Some believe it's privilege or circumstance. But if you look closely, those explanations never fully hold up, because there are talented people who stay stuck. There are hardworking people who never advance, and there are individuals with very little advantage who somehow manage to transform their lives completely. So what is really happening? Why do some lives move forward, while others remain almost frozen in place? Most people assume the answer must be effort. They believe that if someone just tries harder, wants something badly enough, or stays motivated long enough, eventually everything will change. But if that were true, the world would look very different. Because effort has never been rare. Desire has never been rare. Motivation has never been rare. Millions of people wake up every day wanting a better life. Millions of people work long hours. Millions of people try again and again, yet the outcomes remain dramatically different. And this is where something important begins to appear. There is a rule operating beneath everything. A rule that almost nobody talks about, not because it is hidden on purpose, but because most people never notice it. This rule silently shapes results. It influences opportunities. It influences respect. It influences money, relationships, and progress. And once you begin to understand this rule, something unusual happens. You start to see the same pattern everywhere, in successful people, in struggling people, in careers, relationships, and social dynamics. Suddenly, the difference between those who advance and those who remain stuck begins to make sense. The strange thing is that this rule has almost nothing to do with motivation. It has very little to do with desire, and surprisingly, it often has very little to do with effort. Instead, it has everything to do with something far more subtle, something most people never question: the position from which a person operates. Because reality does not respond to effort in the way we were taught. It responds to position. And until someone understands the position they occupy within the system of life, their results rarely change. This is the invisible rule that controls outcomes. And once you see it, you can never unsee it again. Because the world starts revealing the same pattern everywhere you look. But before we explain how this rule actually works, there is something even more surprising. Most people spend their entire lives trying to change their results, without realizing that the real problem was never the results themselves. The real problem was always the position from which they were acting, and understanding this difference changes everything. The invisible rule that controls your results, Part 2. Most people grow up believing something very simple about success. They are taught that results come from effort. If you work harder, you move forward. If you stay motivated, you improve your life. If you want something badly enough, eventually you achieve it. This idea is repeated everywhere. In school, in books, in motivational speeches. The message is always the same. Try harder, want it more, stay motivated, and eventually your life will change. But if you quietly observe how the real world works, a strange contradiction begins to appear. Some of the most exhausted people in the world are also the most stuck. They wake up early, they work long hours, they constantly try to improve their situation, and yet their results barely change. Meanwhile, there are other people who seem to move forward with far less visible struggle. Opportunities appear for them, connections happen naturally, Doors open in ways that almost look effortless. At first glance, this seems unfair. It creates frustration, and for many people, it leads to the belief that life must simply be random. But the deeper truth is something much more precise. The reality we live in is not random. It is structured. There is a system operating beneath visible effort, and that system responds to signals that most people are not even aware they are sending. For example, imagine two individuals entering the same room. They may have similar skills, they may have similar knowledge, they may even have similar experience. But the way people respond to them can be completely different. One person is immediately respected. Their words carry weight. Their presence creates attention. The other person struggles to be taken seriously. They speak, but their words feel lighter. Their presence does not generate the same response. What creates this difference? It is not always intelligence. It is not always talent. And surprisingly, it is often not effort. The difference is position. Every human being operates from a certain internal position. This position influences how they speak, how they move, how they respond to pressure, how they tolerate disrespect, how they pursue opportunities, and the world around them constantly reads these signals, not consciously, but automatically. Reality responds to position the same way a mirror responds to movement. It reflects what stands in front of it. This is why two people can perform similar actions and receive completely different outcomes. Because the action itself is not the strongest signal. The position behind the action is. A request coming from a position of need is received differently than the same request coming from a position of authority. An opportunity pursued from desperation creates a different response than the same opportunity pursued from stability. A person who constantly seeks validation triggers one type of reaction. A person who moves without needing approval triggers another. And once you begin to notice this pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore. You start to see it everywhere. In business, in relationships, in social dynamics, in the way people are treated. The strange part is that most individuals spend years trying to change their results directly. They try to improve their outcomes. They try to increase their effort. They try to stay motivated. But they rarely examine the one thing that actually determines how reality responds to them, their position. And this is where the invisible rule becomes impossible to ignore, because the world does not respond to what you want. It responds to where you stand. And the moment you begin to understand this, you start to see why some people remain stuck for decades, while others suddenly change direction and begin moving forward. Not because they tried harder, but because something far more fundamental shifted. Their position inside the system of reality. The invisible rule that controls your results. Part 3. Once you begin to understand the idea of position, something interesting starts to happen. You begin to notice patterns that were invisible before. The same situations that once looked random suddenly start making sense. Take money, for example. Many people believe that money flows primarily to those who work the hardest, but when you look carefully, that explanation doesn't hold up. Some of the hardest working individuals struggle financially for years. Meanwhile, others seem to attract opportunities that generate far greater rewards with far less visible effort. Why? Because money does not respond only to effort, it responds to position. A person operating from a position of scarcity approaches money very differently than someone operating from a position of stability. Scarcity creates urgency. Urgency creates pressure. Pressure changes how decisions are made. It changes how opportunities are perceived. It even changes how others respond. People can sense it without realizing why. Meanwhile, someone operating from a position of stability sends a completely different signal. Their actions feel calmer. Their decisions appear more deliberate. They are less likely to accept unfavorable conditions simply because they feel they have no other choice. And that difference alone can dramatically alter the opportunities that appear in their path. Now consider respect. Respect is often assumed to come from achievement. People believe they must first accomplish something significant before they can be treated with authority, but reality often works in the opposite direction. Authority frequently comes first. Achievement follows. There are individuals who walk into a room and immediately command attention. Their words carry weight. Their presence alters the atmosphere of the conversation. Others may have equal knowledge, equal experience, and equal intelligence, yet they struggle to receive the same level of respect. The difference is not the information they possess, it is the position from which they communicate. Position determines tone, it determines boundaries, it determines what a person tolerates and what they refuse. And the world constantly reads these signals, not consciously, but automatically. Now look at relationships. This invisible rule appears there as well. Two people may enter a relationship with similar intentions, but the position each person occupies can completely transform the dynamic. Someone operating from fear of loss behaves differently than someone operating from emotional stability. Fear changes communication. It changes how boundaries are enforced. It changes how disagreements are handled. And slowly the entire structure of the relationship adjusts around that position. One person begins to lead, the other begins to follow. Not because it was explicitly decided, but because the system naturally reorganizes itself around the strongest position. This is why the invisible rule becomes impossible to ignore once you recognize it. It appears in business, it appears in friendships, it appears in leadership, it appears in personal growth. People often believe they must change the external circumstances of their lives first. They try to increase effort, they try to improve strategies, they try to search for the perfect opportunity. But external changes rarely hold if the underlying position remains the same. The system simply reorganizes itself back into its previous pattern. That is why many individuals experience temporary progress followed by a return to the same results. The actions changed, but the position did not, and reality always reorganizes itself around position, not effort, not desire. Position, which leads to the most important question. If position controls how reality responds, then how does a person actually change it? Because this is the moment where most people misunderstand the rule completely. They assume position can be changed through temporary confidence, through positive thinking, or through bursts of motivation. But the invisible rule does not respond to temporary states. It responds to something far deeper. And understanding that difference is what separates those who remain stuck from those who eventually transform the direction of their lives. The invisible rule that controls your results. Part 4. At this point, a natural question begins to appear. If position truly controls how reality responds, then why don't more people simply change their position? Why do so many individuals remain stuck in the same patterns for years, sometimes decades? The answer lies in a misunderstanding that is incredibly common. Most people believe position is something psychological. They assume it is created by confidence, or by motivation, or by positive thinking. And because of that belief, they attempt to change their lives by temporarily changing how they feel. They watch motivational videos, they repeat affirmations, they try to convince themselves that they are confident. For a short time, it works. Their energy increases. Their mindset feels stronger. Their actions become more ambitious. But then something strange happens, slowly, almost invisibly. The old patterns return. The hesitation reappears. The doubt resurfaces. The same decisions start happening again. And the person finds themselves back in the same position they were trying to escape. This cycle frustrates millions of people because it feels like progress was made and then mysteriously lost. But the invisible rule explains exactly why this happens. Position is not created by temporary emotion. It is created by structure. Every person develops an internal structure over time. This structure is shaped by experiences, by environments, by repeated interactions with the world. And once this structure forms, it begins to operate automatically. It influences decisions without asking permission. It shapes reactions before conscious thought even appears. For example, imagine someone who has spent years in situations where their voice was ignored. Over time, a structure forms inside them, a quiet expectation that their opinions carry less weight. Even if they consciously want to speak with confidence, this deeper structure influences how they communicate. Their tone changes slightly, their posture shifts subtly, their words become more cautious. None of this is intentional, but the world reads these signals immediately. Reality mirrors the structure that exists beneath the surface, and that is why changing position is not a surface-level adjustment. It is a structural shift. It is the process of reorganizing the invisible framework that determines how a person moves through the world. This is also why certain life experiences suddenly transform people, not because the event itself was magical, but because it forced a structural change. Someone who once tolerated disrespect may reach a moment where they refuse it completely. Someone who once believed opportunities were scarce may experience an environment where possibility suddenly expands. Someone who once doubted their ability may be placed in a situation where they are required to lead, and slowly their internal structure begins to reorganize. New expectations form, new boundaries appear, new standards emerge, and as that internal structure changes, their position shifts. Once that happens, reality begins to respond differently. The same world, the same environment, but a completely different pattern of outcomes, because the system no longer recognizes the same signals. And this is where the invisible rule becomes truly powerful. Because once a person understands that structure determines position, they stop trying to force results. Instead, they begin transforming the structure that produces those results in the first place. And when that shift occurs, the entire direction of life can begin to change. The invisible rule that controls your results. Part 5. Final. Once you see the invisible rule, it becomes difficult to look at life the same way again. You start to realize that many of the struggles people face are not caused by a lack of effort. They are caused by a misalignment of position. For years, someone may try to force results directly. They push harder. They search for better strategies. They try to stay motivated. But if the position behind their actions remains unchanged, the system quietly reorganizes everything back into the same pattern. It is similar to trying to change the reflection in a mirror without moving the object standing in front of it. You can wipe the mirror, you can adjust the lighting, you can even step closer or farther away, but the reflection will continue to follow the object. Reality behaves in a very similar way. Results are reflections. They mirror the position from which actions are taken, and this is why some changes feel incredibly difficult. Not because the goal is impossible, but because the internal structure supporting the old position is still operating in the background. The invisible rule does not respond to temporary bursts of effort. It responds to the deeper signals that define how a person interacts with the world. Once those signals change, the system begins to reorganize. Opportunities appear where none seemed to exist before. Conversations shift. Respect changes, decisions become clearer, Even the types of situations a person encounters begin to evolve. From the outside, it may look like luck, or timing, or coincidence, but beneath the surface, something far more precise is happening. The position changed, and when position changes, reality adjusts. This is why some individuals eventually transform their lives in ways that seem sudden. To an observer, the change appears almost overnight, but in truth, the internal shift happened first. The structure moved, the position changed, and the reflection of reality followed. So the next time you look at your results, instead of asking only what actions you should take, try asking a different question. From which position are those actions coming? Because the invisible rule is always operating, whether we notice it or not, and the moment a person begins to understand it, they gain access to something most people spend their entire lives trying to control without realizing. The system that shapes their results. If this idea made you see things differently, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy exploring the hidden principles that quietly influence how reality works, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next exploration. Sometimes, the most powerful forces shaping our lives are the ones we were never taught to see. And once you learn to notice them, everything begins to look different.